Hello, my name is Matthew Armstrong, and this is the third video in a series of videos on the four strands. So today's video focuses on learning language through listening. So we're looking at meaning-focused input, the meaning-focused input strand. So in particular, we're looking at the activity called read and listen. So if you look at our chart here, which you've seen in the previous videos, we have the four strands, and we're today looking at the listening skill for meaning focus input. So we will look at read and listen, that activity, and I'll also mention extensive listening, which is the same as extensive reading, but it's about listening, obviously. What is a read and listen activity, and what about extensive reading? So remember the previous video was about extensive reading. So just the same, it's listening. The listening that you might do in a language lesson is not the same as extensive listening. So in a lesson you have with a teacher, the teacher will probably give you an audio recording and you listen to it, and it's rather difficult. There are a lot of unknown words. The audio recording might be a minute or 2 minutes or 3 minutes long. There are lots, maybe, who knows, 10, 15 words you don't understand. You have to answer these questions. And then after that, the teacher has you listening for specific words, and then maybe there's some vocabulary work or grammar work. So that would be more like intensive listening. So you have a short, difficult audio, and you really milk that short audio for what it's worth with vocabulary and grammar. So that is not extensive listening. So extensive listening is more about lots of exposure to comprehensible input. So just the same as extensive reading, we need 98% vocabulary coverage of this listening. Now, extensive listening would be basically if you have an audio, okay, if you have a graded reader. We talked about graded readers in video 2 about extensive reading. So if you have a graded reader and the graded reader has audio, then you just listen to that audio and you try to understand it. This can be really difficult for beginners or lower level students or learners, and doing a read and listen activity might provide much more support. So read and listen is basically about you do the reading and the reading supports the listening. So you read text and listen at the same time, and the reading helps you understand what you're hearing. A quarter of a course, a well-balanced course, should be about meaning-focused input. Half of that quarter should be about extensive reading, and the other half of that quarter should be about listening, so read and listen activities or extensive listening. If you're an intermediate learner, or if you're more advanced, you could probably listen to an audiobook of a novel while you're outside running or commuting. If you're lower level, you probably need to do a read and listen activity. Here are some examples of doing this. So read and listen, I described that already. This is probably going to be the best way to develop this. And it does use reading, but you're using that to really help the listening as well. You're going at the speed of listening. And this strand is about lots of comprehensible input, but also there's some unknown language, as in unknown vocabulary and grammar, that 2% that you don't know. So there is learning opportunity there. Another way to get to develop meaning focused input through listening. You get that with speaking practice, basically. If you're speaking to another person, you have to understand what that person is saying, and that is meaning focused input. You get meaning focused input with reading as well. If you're messaging a friend or you're reading an email from a friend in another language, as long as that email isn't too difficult, of course. Um, Usually, if somebody's writing to you, it's at the right level for you, though. Um, all right. So, here are some different ways you can use an audio with text. So, please keep in mind you still need to have 98% coverage of vocabulary with all of these strategies, with most of these strategies, actually. So strategy one is about, it's the most basic one. It's what most people do if they do a read and listen activity. Strategy one is you read in the language you want to learn and you listen to that same language. That develops the listening in the meaning focused input strand. Something else you could do is strategy two. So there's a language you want to learn, Spanish, and uh, you listen, you read the book. You have a book, maybe Harry Potter. You read the book in Spanish. And at the same time, you're listening to it in your first language, for me, English. So, this is a really good way, actually, to. So, for example, I showed you that book in video 2, extensive reading. I showed you the first book where I have 96% vocabulary coverage. It was a Chinese book called Kanjian. So if I had the audio book in English and I read it in Chinese, so I listened to it in English, read it in Chinese, I will learn a lot. Uh, it will be focused on reading, though, not on developing listening, though. All right, so if you're reading in a foreign language and you're listening in your first language, this is a good way to get plenty of comprehensible input. But it's not helping your listening, it's helping reading. And this is a good strategy to use with a novel that you don't have 98% vocabulary coverage with. And I'll describe how I did that in a little bit. When I talk about strategy 4, I'll give you an example. Now, strategy 3, this is something for somebody who's already been successful in language learning. So if you have several languages that are good enough for extensive reading, extensive listening, then you can use 2 languages you've learned. So one with the reading, one with the listening. So I recommend having the reading language is the weaker one, and the listening language is the stronger one. So you'll be going at the speed of listening and following along. So I've tried this with different combinations with German, French, and Spanish with some of the Harry Potter books. And this is a really, really different way of focusing your languages. And believe it or not, it's not as confusing as people might think. You stay really focused, and just this flood of information pours into you. And both, like the essential meaning and message is the same, and uh, both languages are somehow activated at once, and you're comprehending both, like as if two languages weren't different, really. Um, so if you ever get to a point with your language learning in several languages, I encourage you to try that. Actually, don't don't uh, don't knock it if you haven't tried it. So All right, so strategy 4 is something that I've used with a lot of success. So let's say that you don't have 98% coverage with a language. So what can you do? Try strategy 2 first, and then do strategy 1. So I did this with Portuguese using English. So Portuguese is, well, my Spanish level is much better. I have a relatively good level of my reading and listening ability, and Spanish is good enough to handle this. Not the speaking, though. But I speak, my Spanish is good enough to help me a lot with understanding Portuguese. So I did strategy 2 by getting the audiobook of The Alchemist in English, and I got the original Portuguese of the novel The Alchemist, O Alquimista, and I followed along with the English and read the Portuguese, and I learned a lot of Portuguese. Reading, of course, nothing about pronunciation. It was all about reading in the written form of the words, basically. And then I went through the book. It's just maybe 4.5 hours long. Then I went through it again with Portuguese audio and Portuguese reading. And because I was familiar with the story, I was able to follow along really, really well. After doing that, I went on to other books that I was very familiar with, like Harry Potter, and I listened to the first 2 audiobooks using extensive listening only for Harry Potter, the first 2 books of the series in Portuguese. So these are just different strategies you could use with if you have audio and text. Now keep in mind, strategy 1 is the only one that's really helping with the listening part of meaning-focused input. Strategy 2 as well, but it's several languages. So just make sure that you're getting some kind of listening for your meaning-focused input. I've suggested using 2 languages at once with audiobooks before, and the people I've spoken to in person about this, they've usually criticized it and said, wouldn't that be confusing? And actually, it's not as confusing as you'd think, so just try it. So I think the best way to do this is to try it with you're listening to your first language, and the language you're learning is the one you're reading. This doesn't work if you have no knowledge of the first language, of the second language, the language you're learning. It doesn't work if you have no knowledge. For example, I can't do this with Harry Potter in Russian, despite having studied quite a bit of Russian. Can't do it with Arabic because my Arabic isn't good enough, and I can't read that fast in Arabic. I could do that with Portuguese because I'm familiar with several languages similar to Portuguese. So just make sure you have an ability before you try this and then criticize it. So you could just try strategy 2 before you try any other strategies. So once you're used to that, you can experiment with novels, and strategy 3 is something, if your goal is to learn several languages, strategy 3 is something you really need to try. Now, when you're doing read and listen or extensive listening, your goal is not to understand every word, but you really need the 98% vocabulary for it. Because it's not just about getting the gist of what you're listening to or reading. You need to understand the story and how the story is developing and the plot. Otherwise, you're going to get bored and you won't understand some parts of the novel or story or a graded reader that you're following. Just keep in mind that the 98% vocabulary coverage is really important. If it's just one page of text or 1 minute of audio you're listening to, it doesn't matter too much, but if it's pages and pages, it's a big deal. Okay, thank you for sticking with me for this third video on how to develop through listening of the meaning-focused input strand, and I hope you stay with me for the next several videos.